Today, I'm reporting on a moment that literally froze millions of internet users in their tracks, forcing them to stop dead in their tracks and pay attention. It all began when film legend Clint Eastwood sat down opposite a liberal journalist known for her biting interviews. Many thought it would be just another interview, an ordinary exchange between an aging celebrity and an ambitious anchorwoman. But what happened was far beyond expectations. It was a turning point, not only for the show, but potentially for the career of its host. For that evening, the presenter made a mistake that would mark her forever. Convinced she had the situation under control, she thought Clint would be easy prey, an old-fashioned man stuck in the past whom she could ridicule in front of her audience. What she didn't understand was that Clint was no ordinary guest. He was a man forged by decades of criticism, hardship, and media storms, an unshakable rock who had never bowed to pressure. What followed was not a simple answer to a provocative question. It was a real lesson, a lesson in character, in intelligence, and in the power of traditional values. Those many believe to be extinct, but which, in reality, are more relevant than ever. In the studio, everything was ready. Cameras stood by, motionless but ready to capture every expression, every word. Spotlights shone on the glass table separating the two protagonists. The audience, slightly agitated, murmured. Some were discreetly adjusting their phones, hoping to capture the viral moment, the moment when something exceptional would happen. The show was called True Watch, and it was one of the most watched in the United States. It owed much of its success to its daring confrontations, lively debates, and unpredictable exchanges. Presenter Jessica Lange, an elegant blonde in her 30s, had built a reputation as a formidable woman. Her style was direct, incisive, unfiltered. Her specialty? Trapping guests whose ideas were deemed outdated, exposing them to the public's judgment, and pushing them into a corner. Opposite her that evening was 94-year-old Clint Eastwood, a monument to cinema, a living symbol of old-fashioned virility. But he wasn't here to promote a film or defend a cause. He'd simply agreed to come and talk about today's world, the evolution of the entertainment industry, and what it meant to be a man in this day and age. For Jessica, it was a golden opportunity. She had a plan: to use Clint as an example of what happens when you stay locked in the past. The audience could feel it, a subtle tension filling the room, a silent expectation. Something important was about to happen. Jessica had conducted this kind of interview many times before. She knew how to do it, but this time it was different. Facing her was a man who had weathered all the metamorphoses of Hollywood without ever bending, a man who had stood up to the most powerful without ever denying himself. The cameras began to roll, the red light blinked, the show was going live. Jessica flashed a warm smile, perfectly timed to lower her guest's guard. "It's a real honor to have you here, Clint," she said, crossing her legs naturally and tilting her head slightly in that characteristic gesture of someone who already seems to be dominating the conversation. Clint settled comfortably into his chair, unhurried, relaxed, confident. "The pleasure's all mine," he replied in a voice that was husky but poised, almost soothing. Jessica began with banalities. "You've had a legendary career. Actor, director, producer. You gave us unforgettable films, Dirty Harry, Merciless, Gran Torino, cult roles." Clint simply nodded silently, waiting for what was to come. And the next part would change the tone. Jessica leaned slightly toward him. Her smile had grown taut. Her tone became playful, but with a touch of provocation, like a predator slowly approaching her target. "Let's be honest, Clint. Men like you are an endangered species." A murmur ran through the audience. A few people smiled, others exchanged glances. They understood what was happening. Jessica held her angle. She maintained a confident, almost mocking air. "You've built your career on roles as tough, direct, unapologetic men who take matters into their own hands. Let's just say, not exactly the kind of masculinity we celebrate today." She made a well-calculated pause. The audience took the opportunity to absorb her words. Some leaned in a little more, captivated. Then she continued, "Do you think Hollywood has outgrown this model? Don't you think it's time to leave these ideas behind?" A few laughs broke out. The tension rose a notch. The The stage was set. Jessica thought she had the upper hand. But little did she know that Clint Wood was about to completely change the course of the game. They could smell blood. The audience could smell it, like hyenas circling their prey. But Clint didn't flinch, not a blink. He just smiled, and that smile changed everything. The atmosphere in the room changed imperceptibly. The audience's laughter slowly died away. Clint made no movement. He simply stood there, quiet, serene, almost unruffled. Then slowly he leaned back in his chair. He picked up his water glass from in front of him, lifted it calmly, and took a sip, slowly with the same dignity as if he'd been alone in an empty room. The silence deepened. Jessica stared at him intensely. She kept smiling, but it was a false smile. Something had shifted in the air, something invisible, but deeply felt by all. Clint gently placed the glass back on the table. Between his wrinkled fingers, it seemed to hold more than just the glass. It held the word, the moment, the collective attention. And then he spoke, his voice low and poised, split the silence like a sharp blow in the void. Does believing in determination, discipline, and responsibility make me an old-fashioned man? Each word fell like a stone. One by one, the entire room unconsciously readjusted itself. Spectators squirmed in their chairs. Some exchanged glances. Jessica lost her smile for a moment. This wasn't what she'd expected. She'd expected an embarrassed response, an awkward defense, or perhaps even a joke to evade. But no, Clint hadn't moved. He'd waited. He stared at her. He silently invited her to justify why, suddenly, fortitude and a sense of duty had become flaws. Jessica reacted quickly. She was a professional. She straightened her shoulders and smiled again, as if Clint had just proved her right. Then she turned to the audience with expertly measured assurance, as if to rally them to her. "Come on, Clint," she said, tilting her head, mocking but gentle. "Your whole career, you've played tough guys. Guys armed to the teeth, men who solve problems with fists or guns. Brute force." A few laughs broke out in the studio. Heads nodded in amusement. Jessica continued, her voice becoming softer, almost persuasive. "Don't you think it's time for a new kind of hero? A hero who doesn't rely on toxic masculinity to resolve conflicts?" A more open laugh echoed around the room. The audience was ready to see Clint falter, to see him awkwardly defend himself, to embody that vestige of the past Jessica hoped to dismantle. This was her goal, a shock track, a viral moment, the long-awaited admission that this model of man, the hard man, the old-fashioned man, no longer had a place in the modern world. But Clint wasn't playing that game. He didn't answer. He didn't justify himself. He let the words float in the air like smoke that eventually dissipated. The silence lengthened, and then, in a calm voice, he broke the moment. He leaned forward slightly, rested his elbows on his knees, and stared at Jessica. "Let me ask you a question, beautiful," he said in a gentle, almost affectionate, yet strangely untamable tone. The entire studio held its breath. There was something real, solid in his voice. "If tonight a man breaks into your home, do you want a poet or a protector?" The atmosphere stiffened instantly. A few murmurs of astonishment, 2 or 3 discreet applause. Jessica froze for a second, just long enough for the cameras to catch her hesitation. But she was good. She quickly pulled herself together. She laughed lightly, shook her head as if Clint had just said something adorably outdated. "It's a false dilemma, Clint," she replied firmly, but with a hint of nervousness in her voice. "Society doesn't work like an old Western anymore." She glanced around the audience, looking for support, smiles, laughter, but the response wasn't what she expected. The audience was no longer laughing with her. Some repositioned themselves, others crossed their arms, pensive. Clint gave a half smile. He hadn't finished. He didn't look away. He didn't give in. On the contrary, he shattered the illusion. "Look," he said in a calm but implacable tone, "here you are, comfortable, elegant from head to toe, in this secure and comfortable studio, because strong people built this country and continue to make it stand." Jessica lost some of her composure. Her smile tightened. "And you? You dare to make fun of them?" Silence fell, even denser than before. In the audience, murmurs. Some nodded silently. The balance had shifted. The silence deepened still further. A dull tension took hold of the studio. The audience stirred slightly, and discreet murmurs began to circulate. Some of the spectators nodded silently, almost imperceptibly. As for Jessica, she could feel the floor slipping beneath her feet. She nervously moved her index cards between her fingers, looking for a new angle, a way to regain control. But she already knew it was too late. Clint wasn't defensive. On the contrary, he was calling the shots. He had reversed the roles. And everyone in the room understood that, even Jessica. She could feel that the audience, once on her side, was slowly drifting away. She was no longer in a position of strength. And it wasn't even a strategy planned by Clint. He wasn't playing a role. He wasn't nervous or uncomfortable. He was simply in control. Jessica had to act fast. She needed to strike hard to get the show back on the air. So she opted for a personal attack. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her legs slowly, and flashed that millimeter smile she'd perfected over the years. That smile that said, "I'm still in charge," without ever seeming hostile. "Listen, Clint," she began in a tone that was light, almost teasing, but tinged with icy condescension. "I respect your career, I really do. But don't you think it's time? Time to make way, perhaps, for the next generation?" The audience erupted in hesitant laughter. Something was different this time. It was no longer a debate, but an attempt to get rid of her disguised as a joke. Jessica gave a satisfied grin. She felt as if she'd regained the upper hand. It was her favorite maneuver. Make the guest look like a relic of the past, a museum piece. But Clint didn't take the bait. He tilted his head gently, revealing a slow, confident, almost amused smile. He'd seen this before, hundreds of times. He knew exactly how to respond, and he took his time. No sudden movements, no hasty reactions. He simply nodded as if he were seriously considering the question. Then, in a voice that was calm but sharp as a well-honed blade, he blurted out, "It's funny. I remember a time when we respected our elders instead of trying to replace them." A silence, then the explosion. The audience reacts immediately. Applause, exclamations, murmurs of surprise. The energy in the studio had shifted completely. Jessica's smile disappeared. Too late to hide it. Clint leaned forward slightly. His gaze was fixed, straight, and unblinking. "Wisdom never perishes, my dear." The weight of his words fell on the room like a hammer blow. Strong, dry, implacable. Only those who think they know everything ignore wisdom. Jessica wanted to respond, to open her mouth, to seek a repartee, but nothing came out. For the first time, she was unsettled. The audience was no longer with her. The cameras, on the other hand, weren't missing a beat. They were capturing every second of this now historic exchange. The viral moment had just happened, and the interview wasn't even over yet. Outside the studio, the fire had already spread. Someone in the audience had isolated the clip and posted it on Twitter. Within minutes, the video went viral. Trend number 1, #ClintClub, Clint Eastwood puts progressive live host in her place. Jessica Lange regrets trying to humiliate legend Clint Eastwood. At 94, he destroys the woke media narrative. Even the mainstream media couldn't ignore the phenomenon. The next morning, every headline carried the exchange. Some hailed Clint as the embodiment of timeless virility. "You can't undo a legend. We can only remind the world why she deserves respect." Others tried to defend Jessica. An unfortunate moment for the host unfairly attacked. Jessica Lange dared to challenge outdated ideas but was met with a toxic reaction. But the public's verdict was already in. The majority had decided. Jessica, once acclaimed for her sharp repartee, suddenly seemed far less formidable. Clint, for his part, published nothing. No tweet, no declaration, no celebration. He didn't need to. He'd said what he had to say, calmly, with weight, and everyone remembered. You can't undo a legend. Sometimes it's enough to remind the world why it deserves to be respected. As social networks exploded and internet users divided, some tried to come to Jessica's defense. Here and there we read, "An unfortunate moment for the host who was unfairly attacked." Jessica Lange had the courage to challenge outdated ideas, but fell victim to a toxic reaction. But the people had already given their verdict, and it was final. Jessica Lange, once adored, was now alone in the face of a chilled public opinion. The same public that had once cheered her now wondered if she really was as brilliant as she claimed. And Clint, not a word, no message on Twitter, no statement, no follow-up interviews, because he didn't need any. Meanwhile, in the Date True's offices, panic was mounting. Emails were flying. The communications department struggled to contain the fire. A new strategy was needed, to change the story, rewrite the interpretation. The official press release finally came. While we respect Mr. Wood's career and views, it is essential to have conversations that reflect progress and inclusion. We encourage open dialogue around evolving social values. Translation: they had lost control of the message, and they knew it. They tried to present the moment as problematic, as an outdated reaction, but the debate had already overwhelmed them. It was no longer just Jessica versus Clint. It had become something much larger. It was a cultural conversation, a clash between two worldviews. Are we in too much of a hurry to jettison old-school values? Strength, righteousness, respect. Are they really outdated? Or are they more necessary today than ever? What's left of respect for experience, for wisdom, for the generations that came before us? Clint had entered the studio for a simple interview, but he emerged as the unwitting initiator of a national debate. And what's more, he didn't even have to raise his voice. While TV commentators and social network influencers scrutinized every second of the exchange, analyzing silences, glances, and retorts, Clint simply went on with his life. A week later, a journalist found him outside a small cafe in Carmel, California. He was wearing a dark jacket with a black coffee in his hand, looking out over the ocean with the same unshakable serenity. "Mr. Wood, do you have anything to say about the interview that went viral?" Clint adjusted his jacket, took a sip of his coffee, and smirked. "No," he replied simply. Then he turned and walked away in no hurry, because true legends can't be explained. They don't try to convince. They don't fight to win debates on the internet. They stay true to their principles. And sometimes that's all it takes to remind the world that strength, wisdom, and integrity will always have their place. But what about you? Are old school values really dead? Or are they more precious today than ever? Tell me in the comments. And if you'd like to discover more stories this powerful, subscribe. You certainly won't want to miss the videos we publish every day. Take care of yourself.